It all began when my mom gave an ultimatum of saying, either you continue going to this therapy, this program to heal, or I have to leave you. And unfortunately, he stopped going. And so my mom left with all of us thinking it would be maybe a day, and that became days, weeks, months, years. I have had very limited contact. Like, I talked to him over the phone. At this point, it'd be almost 4 years ago.
Some people are just like still feeling maybe a lot of anger toward a parent who neglected them.
There's a lot of, like father wounds that are not wounds of abuse, thanks be to God, or wounds of other things, but wounds of absence. So losing him at that time was really pivotal for me. In forgiveness and in acceptance, the person who has the most liberation is the forgiver, not the forgiven.
Wow. No, you're bringing up so many great points.
When you're in a bad state and you're worried or you're anxious, you should not make big decisions.
How have you processed things, would you say?
We think of sensitive as an inherently negative thing. And just because something is common does not make it any less intense.
There's something really powerful in that. Welcome to the Restored Podcast. I'm Joey Panarelli. If you come from a divorce or a broken family, this show is for you. We help you heal your brokenness, navigate the challenges, and build healthy relationships so you can break that cycle and build a better life. My guest today is Tommy. Tommy is an unapologetic New Jersey native who grew up without a father, but through the presence of father figures, discovered this passion he has for mentoring young people in an increasingly fatherless world. And as you probably know, in so many places in our world, we're facing an epidemic of fatherlessness. And fatherlessness not only leaves a wound like an invisible mark, but it also shapes how you view yourself, how you handle your emotions, and how you love in relationships. And so the question is, are fatherless children doomed? Not at all. In fact, Tommy shows how to compensate for what you didn't receive from dad and how healing is within reach. In this episode, we also discuss things like his dad's spiral into mental illness and even homelessness and why Tommy hasn't seen him in over a decade. The difficult balance between helping versus enabling someone who has a mental illness. We talk about the two extremes that we all fall into with emotions and how Tommy has found the healthier path. We discuss all the ways that father hunger shows up in dating relationships, causing us to seek what we didn't receive from the wrong people. We hit on what it's like to feel too messy for your friends and how Tommy finally stopped believing that. And finally, the lies that he carried for years, thinking I'm all alone and I have to earn love, and the truth he found to break that grip. And so if you've experienced any sort of fatherlessness, this episode is for you. In this episode, we do talk about God and faith. And if you don't believe in God, you're totally welcome here. Anyone who's been listening to this podcast knows that we're not a strictly religious podcast. Wherever you're at, again, I'm glad you're here. If you don't believe in God, I would just challenge you to listen with an open mind. Even if you were to skip the God parts, you're still going to get a lot from this episode. And with that, here's the conversation. Tommy, great to have you here, man. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Joey.
I know your story is quite intense, and I'm excited to dive into that and just learn more about everything that's happened. But I'm just so honored that you would come on the show. And as we usually do, I'm curious from what you remember or what you were maybe told if you were super young, what was life like before your parents split?
I'm going off of entirely what I've been told because they split when I was not even a year yet. I think it was about 6 months. And so maybe I can get into this a little bit more later, but there's actually kind of a part of my story of just the implications of like there being problems and difficulties before I was even conceived. And the act of faith my mom went through to even be open to the conception of me. And so in a beautiful way in my life, I very instinctively know my life's a miracle. Every life's a miracle. But I think that's also come with some baggage, though, of like the feeling of like you have a debt to pay, of like making your life worth something, and so forth, you know. But yeah, so I don't really know what life was like before. I've been told on good faith that it was good and they had a very holy and happy marriage. But obviously that only lasted so long. Yeah, I want to make sure I'm not jumping ahead in the right order of questions, I suppose. But my parents' situation is unique in the sense that it wasn't like they were splitting because of fighting or disagreements. It kind of goes up the family tree a little bit because my grandfather, unfortunately, was a alcoholic and very abusive. I know physically, I believe it often comes with verbal abuse as well. And I think my aunts, because they're daughters, he was more gentle with them in both respects. And so I think they obviously have their own level of baggage and trauma they've dealt with. But I think the boys, unfortunately, my uncles and my dad, had more of a brunt to pay, so to speak, in terms of like kind of the old-fashioned 1950s, you know, leather belt, discipline, and so forth. And so with that, I think I can unpack this a bit more later, but it's not like I have this resentment toward my parents or difficulty with that. It's very understandable. And, if I look at what happened to my dad's illness, as a result of his trauma, it makes sense that they had to split. And so they're civilly divorced, but they're not annulled. They never sought an annulment. My mom didn't seek an annulment, but essentially my dad's got crippling OCD. It's actually a pretty common thing of obsessive compulsive disorder, and a lot of people do actually have some form of it. It's much more than simply like feeling like the need to tidy all the time or something like that. For those who are not familiar, OCD essentially is you have an irrational obsession, a fear, and in order to kind of ease that fear, you have a compulsion, which is like some kind of weird or, again, compulsive action in order to kind of ease that anxiety. So for my dad, he had issues for a lot of his life, but I guess was able to deal with it or kind of package it up or to, I'm trying to find the right phrasing, cope with it and obviously get married and be okay and functional for several years to have 4 children. But I think night school and a lot of stress at work and other things kind of broke him. And then I guess a lot of old habits and old trauma kind of came back rearing its ugly head. And he just developed a lot of very obvious OCD. But to be honest, I feel like there's a lot more because it seems like I've never heard of a case of OCD as bad as his.
Wow.
To this day, I think he's still homeless. He's kind of a paradox and a contradiction because on the one hand, he's constantly showering and scared of germs, like a hypochondriac. But on the flip side, he's also hoarding because he's trying to recycle. And so there's a lot of strange habits he's built. And so as a result, though, he's often booted as a tenant, to rent. And so that's rendered him homeless. And yeah, it's been hard to kind of from a distance know he's struggling and just trying to figure out that relationship, especially as I've become an adult with my own family and my children's relationship to their grandfather. So that's definitely more than what you asked initially.
No, I love it. Well, let's go there. So thank you for sharing. And that's kind of what I was alluding to by the intensity of it. I'd known some of these details from afar and man, that's so hard. And I think you're right. When people hear OCD, they think like, oh, I'm just kind of a perfectionist or something like that. But it's like we're talking like clinical OCD here where it's like intense. And I've known a couple of people who've had it pretty bad, maybe not to that level where, they had maybe a huge obsession with germs. And so they would constantly like wash their hands to the point where it would like get really bad, like raw skin, things like that. So that's another example that I can think of. But I'm curious, with kind of his current state, how much contact do you have with him if you're open to sharing? And then how do you navigate that whole like tension between like maybe wanting to help versus knowing that if you become like a crutch, then that will do more harm? Yeah,
you're asking a question that unfortunately is still very present and still very much asked. And I think because, the past 5 years, I've gotten married, I have 2 children now. And so it's, transitioning from being a child to being a college student to being a young adult to being now kind of an independent husband and father. So I think we unfortunately fortunately we had a very good system growing up and seeing him. It was on a regular basis. I think when I was much younger, it was like maybe twice a year, Easter and Christmas, maybe 3 times. That'll be more rare. It's typically twice a year. And then it kind of dwindled down to once a year. Easter was kind of the Kalaki holiday to see him. And then I'm forgetting the reason. I know it was on his end. He just decided again, it was like his growing up, we always say, oh, his illness. We don't know why. He just said that he can't come. And so that was the last time I saw him was the summer before I went to college. So it's been over a decade since I've seen him.
Wow.
I have had very limited contact. Like I talked to him over the phone. At this point, it'd be almost 4 years ago. On the phone, I received a letter from him, and I've sent him a couple of letters. But again, part of his illness is that like he has no phone, he has no car. Because he's also kind of, I don't think he's schizophrenic. He might be, but he's definitely paranoid. And so I did think about him a lot during COVID of like, on the one hand, hypochondria, the fear of germs. But on the flip side, COVID obviously was boxed with lots of conspiracy theories and the government and world takeover and all kinds of crazy stuff. So I almost imagine him suffering from both of those, of like the fear of the government and the fear of germs. And so I wonder how he dealt with that. But the point being is that it's very difficult to get in touch with him. And so how I approach it is like, I would love a relationship with him and for him to know my children, his grandchildren. I know from a distance, it gives him a lot of pride and joy from what we've done with our lives and now his grandchildren. Because my 2 children and actually my brothers, they're expecting, so 1 more on the way. But I think there has to be boundaries. And I think the big part of his illness is sort of trying to like violating boundaries. And so you have to have very firm lines in the sand. And insofar as he can't do it or is not willing to do that, then unfortunately you have to kind of take a step back. But I think in an ideal world, and hopefully this can be a reality sooner than later, there can be sort of negotiations, if you will. I hate to use such a business term, but that's kind of how it's been felt in order to cultivate a relationship that's healthy, but not invasive, because he would easily sort of overstep boundaries, unfortunately. And therefore I have my primary duties to my children and to make sure that, Grandpa is not just randomly showing up and expecting to kind of just crash in our house for, months or, who knows? I mean, there's been incidents of him, not having kind of a reality check of what's possible and what's not. And so, yeah.
No, thanks for going into all that and sharing. And I think one of the things I noticed in you, just even in the way you talk about your dad, is you have a lot of compassion for him, which I know some people aren't there yet. Some people are just like still feeling maybe a lot of anger toward a parent who neglected them or walked away or whatever the case was. And I'm sure there's those emotions there for you too. But but that's like, I think, a really beautiful lesson for all of us listening, that I think there is a way, almost always, if not always, to develop some sort of compassion. Like I heard a quote recently that said, it's hard to hate close up. Like if you really get to know people and like learn their stories and realize like, wow, they had a really difficult life and they had trauma of their own and they had this mental illness. And like, that was similar with my dad. Like, a lot of trauma growing up. He, has bipolar disease. It's been really hard on him. And I cannot imagine, like, I don't know what I would do personally if I had that disease. Yeah. And so I think there's something really, I think, good and beautiful about that. And obviously that can lead to forgiveness and a lot of things. But at the same time, I hear you saying, like, that doesn't mean that anything goes. Like, you have to have proper boundaries, not just for you and your family, but also for his good, because it wouldn't be good for him to be able to, maybe get away with things or do things that would ultimately, harm him.
Yeah, it was definitely, I think, I can speak more about this later, but my mom handled it by and large incredibly and honorably, and I admire her so much for her strength and her witness, even just to her faithfulness, fidelity, and it's having such a hard life herself as a single mother. It's just, it's unbelievable. However, there was like, is difficult where it felt like opening the dad box was like a huge, Pandora's box of emotions. And so it felt like the routine was sort of like, on the once or twice a year visit where we saw dad on the way back home from Pennsylvania, back to New Jersey, we'd have our dad conversation that was like, the box is opened and it was like exhausting, and then close the box. And so there wasn't really open conversation about that reality. And I think there's, different personality temperaments in my family, why that would perhaps be the case, or I guess preferences of, not needlessly constantly stirring up emotions, which completely makes sense. But I think I've always been told my dad's a very good man, but he's a sick man. And so that's kind of the narrative I've always recognized and believed in. And I still believe that, and I know that. But there's also a healthy balance to not paint him as I've also had to kind of almost go backward in my process of recognizing what's happened in my own childhood to recognize, is there no fault in my dad? Is it all trauma, or is there some level of culpability? And that's a hard line. And I don't even know how to draw that line, because I don't know, what is his own free will versus his illness. And that's kind of one of those unique situations with my story, but every story is different. So.
Yeah, no, that's a big question. And I think it's harder and harder to like draw that line the more intangible the like disability is. Cause I think like with things, I don't know, if someone like lost their legs, it's like, well, obviously they can't walk. And there's some like literal physical limitation that you kind of get hit in the face with, or they have cancer. So they never have much energy. So they can't really like play with their kids. Like, so it's kind of a tangible, at least visible way of like explaining their behavior. But with mental illness, especially, I've seen it's like, my goodness, everything on the outside can appear fine. Like it can appear like you're like anyone else, but you are just as sick as that person with cancer.
Yeah. No, and that's a great way of putting it. It's felt gray. And I think actually in my process of accepting it in a deeper level, like I think in a weird way, I grew up with a healthy, but at times an unhealthy level of ownership. Like, I think sometimes we overstep the line of like, oh, we're the family that has a really hard story, but we own our cross, we embrace our cross, and we're mature and we're happy. And sometimes I think, I want to tread lightly here to not sound like I'm disparaging any of my family, but I think that sometimes that like with that ownership, there came like a lack of permission to kind of struggle sometimes, or to feel like a little anger or frustration or deal with this messy emotions. And it's like, nope, this is our cross, and we accept it. And it can sometimes tread into kind of a stoicism. The point I guess I'm trying to make is that with mental illness, it is very gray and it's hard to draw lines. And I think sometimes the narrative, especially for me, because I was the youngest, was very black and white of like, he's good, but he's sick. And it's like, okay. And I think that's a great narrative to tell a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, even a 6, 7, 8, whatever. But I think that narrative kind of stayed. Yeah. And as I'm in college, or then even as a young adult, it's like, well, is that, just, it's that black and white. And I think there's a beautiful simplicity to that, and to have a simple faith of just, believing that to be the case. But then there's also been instances that have occurred where I see some gray area and trying to process that. And so I think for that reason, there has to be a level of, I don't want to say wiggle room, but just an acceptance that ultimately is merciful and compassionate, but also allows for the messiness of emotions, and let that iron itself out, as opposed to sort of like, well, it's a cross that is. And then when you start to kind of bury things, they'll still be there to process maybe a decade later, but those unprocessed emotions will still be there.
Wow. No, you're bringing up so many great points. I'm taking tons of notes here. So a few things. I want to talk about how your mom handled things in a second to kind of like finish painting the picture of like what life was like for you. And then we'll kind of go fast forward in the story. But before getting to that, one point I heard from a psychologist was, just this tendency that we have between maybe brooding over like emotions and difficulties in life too much, right? We get caught in them. We are constantly thinking about them, talking about them. That sounds like that was not the problem in your family, in your life. On the other hand, we have people.
Stoicism.
Yeah. Like on the other hand, we have people like who bottle things up and never talk about things. It's like, yep, that thing happened years ago and we never even mention. So brooding and bottling, neither great and healthy. But yeah, when it comes to Stoicism, I want to touch on that a little bit, whether, in your childhood or even over the years. What's been your like relationship with like, I don't know, difficult emotions and things? You alluded to this already, but I'm curious if Stoicism looked as something like good and virtuous, which maybe there is virtue in it, or, how did you kind of handle all these difficult emotions, especially since maybe you didn't see that modeled super well? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I joke now, it's like I grew up in a Irish family, which is kind of like a perfect mix of bottling things up or, like there's actually, I laugh, but, there's like a conversation I had with my uncle, and I was like in high school at this point. Maybe eighth grade. I think it was like in high school. And he's like, yeah, and your Uncle Kevin, he's gay. And I was like, really? And he's like, you didn't know that? And I was like, no. I'm not disparaging that at all, but there's certain like big family things I just never was told, just like,
sure. It's like kind of huge. And you're like, I'm just learning about this right now.
I can laugh about it now, of course. And I actually wrote an article about this for a magazine one time. And I think that writing that article itself was a bit of a process for me, which was good. And I think the theme of the article that I actually hit on was this very question of like this relationship between a sort of toxic stoicism that sort of says, well, it is what it is, deal with it, move on. And then the flip side of like a brooding is brooding and bottling. I like that dichotomy. I think I called it what did I say? Or just, the victimhood mentality. And on the flip side, you have stoicism that's gone too far. So I think, I won't say stoicism, but a serenity is good. Obviously, like Lord, give me the serenity prayer. Lord, give me the, how's it go? The strength to change the things that I can, the patience to accept the things that I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference. I'm paraphrasing more or less what it is. But there's also a sense of like accepting the things that you can't. And I think with Stoicism, part of the problem is that it's correct in recognizing there are many things in life you can't change. But the problem though is that it doesn't have like a more of an interpersonal recognition of your own emotions and the validity of those. And so just because your emotions and your rationality are distinct does not mean that discussing emotions rationally is not needed, I think there's not just a legitimate, but a necessary process in understanding your emotions and their messiness and allowing reason to kind of, comb through it. But then, the goal has to be trajected towards something, has to have a trajectory and finish line, which is acceptance and allowing that wound, that cross to heal you, to transform you, to be part of your story. I think for my life, perhaps is a little too, what's the word? Yeah, I think it tended toward like, yep, it's part of our story. We're stronger for it. We're better for it. And that's definitely true. And I'm speaking from the youngest sibling where, I was the back end of that where perhaps like I was kind of lumped in with everyone's story when my emotions hadn't yet fully processed perhaps. But so I think that's the one extreme. On the flip side though, of course, you have this, brooding, this sort of victim mentality. And the biggest problem with victimhood is that it requires a villain. And, you mentioned before, what if you get cancer or your legs chopped off or it's amputated or you get into a car accident? Like there's a whole number of things that can happen that are tragic, that are not moral evils, but are natural evils. You lose sight in one eye. Like, are you going to blame, really you just either blame nature or you blame God. Like there's no one really to blame. And so if you don't have a villain, the victim can't really go anywhere. And so ultimately they say in forgiveness and in acceptance, the person who has the most liberation is the victim, is the forgiver, not the forgiven. And so I think in that sense, you have to have that tension proper of recognizing the validity of your emotions, but not allowing those emotions to tie you down forever. And the flip side, for acceptance or stoicism, it's to move on, to recognize these are real things and I can't change them, but not to make that a marching order to not think about it and to kind of bury them, because burying things doesn't actually do anyone any good.
Yeah, no, so
Yeah.
good. You made me think of the psychologist I mentioned before who kind of mentioned the brooding and the bottling, Dr. Susan David. She's a Harvard psychologist, and she wrote a book called Emotional Agility, and she kind of outlines emotional agility. It's been really helpful for me as kind of like the ideal. She says it's not, she kind of shies away from the term emotional intelligence because it sounds fixed, like you can't learn how to better master and navigate your emotions. But she basically says emotional agility is your ability to face and feel your emotions. Like we're not running from them, we're not hiding from them, we're not stuffing them away, but then choosing your response in a way that aligns with your deepest held beliefs, which we'd essentially call, virtue. And so I like her definition though, because I think there's something in that. It's like, okay, no, we're not just like brushing them away. We're facing them. We're feeling them. Because I think what the problem with Stoicism that I see, like when you were talking, it became more clear, is that it doesn't like allow any sort of like grieving as one component to it. It's like, nope, you got to just keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a problem. And I think that actually leaves people more stuck in the long run. But yeah, I think her like focus on emotional agility and kind of the two components being like feeling it all, but then still using your will, your intellect to choose like what's good, what the good next action, next step, even in the midst of all of it. Okay, real talk. If you've been trying to get in shape so you feel better physically and emotionally, but nothing is working, you're not crazy. I've been there myself. I recently read a free guide by Dakota Lane, a certified personal trainer who we've partnered with that's helped about 1,000 people, and it was really helpful for me personally. In the guide, he breaks down the biggest fitness mistakes that we all make, like under-eating, overstressing, or focusing too much on the scale. And he gives really simple, practical tips that you can actually use, that you can implement today. And so if you're tired of feeling like you're never going to get in shape, just click on the link in the show notes and grab the guide today. It's totally free, and it might just be the thing you need to start feeling healthier physically and emotionally.
I think also, I'm a Catholic, and part of the Christian narrative, if you will, is ethos, probably a better word to use, is to allow suffering. Suffering is inevitable. When Christ came, he didn't take away suffering, and that kind of shocked a lot of people at the time. Of like, I thought the Savior was going to take everything away, and he didn't take away suffering. He just transformed suffering into meaning and gave it meaning. It shows how to suffer, so to speak. He also, throughout the Gospels, Christ is healing people, but first through sin, by forgiving their sins, and then like, can you make me not paralyzed anymore? And he's like, well, yes, I can fix your natural evil, but the moral evil and forgiveness is the more important thing to heal. And I think for the victim, the suffering becomes just a debt to pay off. Like, someone needs to pay this debt that's not mine. And that's legitimate. A lot of us suffer when it's not our fault. Like, why did I grow up without a father my whole life? And many of the people, why did my parents have an ugly divorce when I was in high school or whatever? And that's a legitimate question. But then, like, who is going to like pay that debt, so to speak? And you can get stuck in that and not allowing that suffering to kind of form you. And the flip side with a stoic, or I should say toxic stoicism, it takes that suffering and it kind of casts it aside as irrelevant. But neither actually embracing the suffering and allowing that suffering to mean something and then to grieve it, but then also to allow it to transform you. I think, Ave crux spes unica, hail the cross, our only hope. There's a sense in which, Christ suffered the most, but also showed us the meaning of suffering and allows us to look to the cross, not in a kind of a depressing or glorifying of suffering way, but in a way of recognizing that we are still in a vale of tears, but there's hope. That hope is in heaven, and suffering can transform us to actually make us even stronger pilgrims as we make our way on our journey. And we won't be unscathed, but actually there are certain, I guess, what's the word? Crosses or hurdles or something, even scars that actually, if properly embraced in a healthy way, can actually strengthen us and not actually hinder us at all.
Wow. So good. And that thought of that, Jesus could have just taken away suffering is kind of wild. Like, at least he, has like the power to do that, but he chose not to. So there must be some wisdom, some goodness in it, which is kind of wild to think about, or some good that can be brought out of it, I should say. Yeah, no, it's wild. And the more I think about, I don't know, just life in general, it's like, we're not really here for very long on earth, one, in the grand scheme of things. And two, we're pretty much guaranteed to suffer. Yeah. Like, I even think of it now, like with my life, I have a wife, I have 2 kids, another baby on the way at this point. And,
congrats. Wow.
Thank you. Yeah. And it's awesome. And I love it. And when things are going well, like we're in like a good season, like kind of on an up spiral, it's like, this is great. It would be nice if it was like this way forever. Yes. And then there's kind of the sobering reality. It's like, well, there might be a call one day that something really bad happened. There might be this, I don't know, who knows, something that like I might not even be able to stomach at some point. And I don't, go there often, but it's kind of this reality that like, no, life is hard and suffering is inevitable. But what you just mentioned, I think, is the only reason there's any sort of hope. Otherwise, it's like everything's meaningless.
I mean, you have to give Nietzsche credit, where he was consistent, at least philosophically, where he, says God is dead, but then the conclusion is meaninglessness, or to kind of like will to power, kind of like tread through the chaos together and try to blaze your own trail. It's at least philosophically consistent, but it is depressing. But some people are saying there's no greater narrative to life, there's no greater meaning to life, just kind of postmodernism in a nutshell, but then don't want to accept the fact that life is meaningless. But then they're also prescribing there's not really a greater arching meaning or arc to history itself, or life itself, or existence itself. And so, yeah, this is where I think there's the accusation that religion is kind of just a medication to kind of make sense out of things. Or you can believe there's also some truth there, that it's not just a Band-Aid or an Advil pill or something, but it's in fact a recognition that there's something, a greater horizon beyond your imminent and present suffering. And therefore that can actually have a transformative and a relevance to this chapter in your book of life. And that this chapter will end and then a new chapter will begin. And there'll be a reason and relevance and transformation from that chapter.
Love that. Yeah, you make me think of Viktor Frankl too, who I've mentioned a lot in this show, but I love his stuff and how, he just contradicted Freud, who said that the only thing we want as humans is pleasure. Yeah. Because, life is fleeting and we just want to fill ourselves with the most pleasure that we can. But Freud, came out very strongly contradicting him, saying, no, that's not what we want more than anything. The thing we want more than anything is meaning, as a deep reason to live that's bigger than ourselves. Yeah. And he said that when our lives are void of meaning, that's when we're most tempted to this like mindless pleasure. I think it's so true. And yeah, and I love what you're saying about all of this. Feel free to interject any final thoughts there, but I had one further thought about Stoicism. And I remember going through kind of my family's breakdown. I remember kind of being suspicious and skeptical of like emotion, and not to get too deep into like Catholic theology here, but I kind of misinterpreted St. Ignatius on like when he was just talking about like consolation and desolation. To anyone listening, obviously we all go through periods in life where things are good, and and I'm simplifying this a ton, but when we're kind of in a good state, we're in a good emotional state, and then we also go through stages in life when things are like really dry and desolate and hard. And so more or less, I thought the goal was to be like somewhere in the middle. Kind of, like a Stoic. And I remember just feeling like really empty and not really, life was very bland, because when I was trying to kind of not avoid the highs, but also avoid the lows. And then I remember visiting my brother who was studying in Austria, and just experiencing like the beauty of creation and like having a great time with other people and like traveling and experiencing other cultures, like good food, all that stuff. And, I was actually like in the end of high school. It's kind of a crazy situation. I was able to go visit him. But, anyway, long story short, I just realized like, that it was no way for me to live, and that there's actually a lot of depth and beauty to life and a lot of meaning that can be found. And that's kind of the way I've been trying to live my life ever since. But it was a big transformation for me. And maybe I'm not articulating it super well, but it almost like reality got color added to it when it was like kind of black and white, or at least I thought that was the idea.
Well, I think I heard this analogy for prayer, but I think it applies to life at large. And for prayer, some people say, well, are you in love with the Lord, or are you in love with the feeling that you think you get from the Lord? Or it's a very common thing from churchgoers or Catholics especially, like, I don't get anything out of the Mass, or I don't get anything out of going to church, which kind of indicates a sense that you're going with the expectation that I need to receive something, and if I don't feel it, then it's not worth my time. And so there's like a dichotomy there of like, okay, well, do we just need to kind of trudge through and just, do the things we need to do, and that's it? And that kind of gets back to kind of talk Stoicism of just sort of like, do your due diligence and that's it, and feelings don't have complete irrelevance. Or do you chase the sentimentality and the feeling of, consolation and so forth? And that's also a problem. And so again, this is an analogy for prayer, but I think it applies to life, where you need to have form and fire, like form meaning discipline and getting up and going despite your feelings, with the wind. The wind blows in your favor or blows against you. But either way, you stick to your disciplines and what you ought to do. And you make those moments, as Ignatius does say. I work at Jesuit high school, so I've done some Ignatian formation, but you want to make good decisions in consolation when you feel clear-headed. And when you're in a bad state and you're worried or you're anxious, you should not make big decisions, because that's when you're like, oh, quick, change things, But then, so when you stick to your disciplines, especially when it gets difficult, but then it doesn't stop you from recognizing the goal that you still want to feel and you still want to be consoled, is probably a better word to use, from prayer. And the goal of prayer ultimately is intimacy with the Lord. And so for life, I think there's the same thing. You want to live a happy life that looks like Instagram perfect and so forth. We all know that's not realistic. And so do you just say, oh, screw it all, and I'm just going to live life and pay my bills, and death and taxes are the only two inevitable things, and that's the narrative of life? Or do you recognize your duties and trudge through those difficult moments and chapters of life, but still never stop trying to make sure that you are experiencing, everyone lives, but what's the cheesy phrase? Everyone dies, but not everyone lives or something.
Yeah.
But the same idea of how to, stick to your disciplines, but then still not become cynical and sort of like accept a sort of a subtle despair of like, yeah, it's how it goes, how life is. But still never stop living life to the fullest.
Love that.
Yeah.
No, it's really good. And I mean, I see that in you and knowing a little bit about, your family, and I definitely am trying to live that out in my family too. So I do think it's possible. I see people do it, and I think there's a lot of like joy and beauty there for sure. Yeah. And I've heard, I think it was Dr. Ted Suri who kind of similarly talked about like loving your spouse, about how you're not always going to feel it. You need to like will it, but it's also true that like, hopefully there's like emotion that comes along with it as well. So I like that, that balance.
That's a really good parallel there, is that like, yes, philosophically speaking, love is located in the will and not in the passions, so not in the emotions. But then people take that too far. It's like, true love is in the will, it's just like, will you marry me? And it's like, well, that's not very romantic. Like, you still wish and hope that there's a parallel, if you will, between the will and the passions, right? So like the passion should be a reflection as opposed to a driver. And so, like love should be a sentiment that accompanies what is technically primary, which is what you choose. What you choose ultimately is the measure of your love. So sometimes you choose the difficult but the higher good when you don't feel it. But you shouldn't just be like living life just like begrudgingly doing everything that apparently is good without a sense of seeking harmony among your whole human faculties of intellect, passions, and will.
I love that. Yeah. Hopefully you get alignment there. And, I found like a lot of times your like emotions, your passions like can follow your will too. So it's like if if I'm not like feeling crazy in love with my wife, if I act, as a man who loves and who is in love, then those things will follow. But man, I could talk to you forever about this stuff. Anything else you'd add about like, I guess, childhood or growing up in terms of, just what that was like, just to finish that picture of your, kind of child rearing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just reiterate that I'm deeply grateful for the mostly totally accurate picture that my dad is a good man, but he's a sick man. But I think that narrative was at times too simplistic, and therefore, as a result, led to a feeling of a lack of permission, if you will, to process the mess, or like, well, and to. Yeah, and I think anger as a sole response is not correct, but having seasons of anger or questioning or confusion is totally healthy to be processed. So I think that's, I'm again speaking to the more of a Stoic mentality of like, this is what it is and it's good, and we move forward. And I think that was by and large the best way to kind of grow up and to recognize and love my dad from a distance. But of course, there were questions that popped up as I got older of even just holes and not knowing a lot of big details of my dad and so forth. So I think everyone's story is different. Everyone's process for processing is different. And so I think there just needs to be permission, and that goes back to the same thing we've been talking about of having a sort of a mercy or acceptance of an ugly, or not ugly, but a messy process, while still recognizing the ultimate goal is acceptance and moving forward and being transformed by those things. But not allowing that to be premature, because there's a book, the body keeps a score, which talks about, the physicality of things, but there's a sense of like emotions need to be processed whether you like it or not, and you can pretend like you're not emotional or you're fine, but then that's just putting a timeline in the bottle, and eventually it'll come out later. And so it's just better to recognize the need to process those things in due time.
That's good. How have you processed things, would you say? I know we've maybe touched on it a little bit, but I'm curious, what's been helpful, I guess, for you in terms of dealing with all that stuff, and especially the emotions? I
think there were incidents in my life that manifested that, were, I guess I want to say strange, but were revelatory. And I realized it wasn't me, it was actually mentors. In one case, a spiritual director who kind of helped me see a greater narrative going on. So for instance, like when I went to college, I dated a girl my freshman year, which was by and large a really good relationship. But I think there was, even to my own knowledge, a lack of awareness of some deeper things I was seeking, actually in a father, that I was actually trying to seek wrongly, obviously, in a girlfriend. And I'm not painting the entire picture, but there is these kind of undertones. And so when, she broke up with me, and I was still struggling and processing it way later, like even like a year, my spiritual director's like, whoa, okay, that's definitely not this girl. Like, it's hard to be broken up with, obviously, but there's definitely something else going on. And we kind of unpacked that it actually was still stuff with my dad. And actually the fact that my grandfather, who was basically the closest I had to a father in my life, passed away right before I went to college. And I had kind of like a family habit, just buried it, didn't really process it. I felt like I mourned it, but didn't actually really mourn his passing and realizing how huge that was to lose him. And to lose him at a crucial time in my life when I would have began asking him those deeper questions of life, of what it means to man and so forth. My older brother had that opportunity, and I'm obviously I'm not envious. I'm very grateful he had that. But there's definitely like undertones of a little jealousy of desiring the same for myself, that he got this whole summer of just hearing my grandfather's wisdom pour into him. And I didn't get that. And so losing him at that time was really pivotal for me. And so that's one example out of a couple of recognizing this, okay, there's still stuff I have to process here. And so in this particular relationship in college, I think there was, one thing I would highlight is that she was definitely not apt to give compliments that she didn't mean. In this sense, there's a sense of a parallel of, the father figure. When he makes a sense of compliment, he means it. So I'm not, saying she was like masculine, but I am saying that there was this, that was an attractive quality of sort of like, she means what she says. That also meant when we broke up, when she said certain hurtful things, those carried a lot of weight. Just the same, the compliments carried a lot of weight. So obviously I would highlight a lot of good things from that came out of that, but I also am very grateful actually for that experience by which I uncovered unfinished work in my own masculine heart. And also, I think that's also where my prayer life really soared, because I felt like I was just totally naked and had nothing left. And also realized how bad I was in making male friendships at college. So that really, I cleaned up my act there, because I poured way too much into this relationship my freshman year. So I think that was, I can highlight a few things, but that's the one big thing I want to highlight is like a pivotal moment from my life of recognizing, okay, wow, there's a lot of, like father wounds that are not wounds of abuse, thanks be to God, or wounds of other things, but wounds of absence. And I've had powerful moments in prayer where the Lord kind of actually didn't even speak to me. He was sort of present to me, and recognizing him speaking, kind of an answer to prayer of presence, as opposed to some kind of like, lie that I needed to be healed from or so forth. So there's more to say, obviously, but that's, I think, one that is pivotal for me that I would highlight.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I love how you mentioned mentors and just how important they were. We'll get to that in a little bit, because I think that's just so important. That's been so helpful and healing for me too. But it's so interesting you bring up this idea of like kind of going to the woman for something you never got from dad. And I've been there, and I know, I'm sure you've read John Eldridge and Wild at Heart and Father by, yep, totally. Like great books. Anyone who hasn't read them and who just wants to, even like women listening, if you want to understand men, John Eldridge has good hand on the pulse. And for men, it's just, it will just give you a lot of insight into yourself. But I just remember him talking about like how, I might butcher this, but the man goes to the woman to like offer his strength, not to find it. Yeah. And man, have I found myself like going to the woman to find strength, to find affirmation, just find, again, those things, the affirmation, the love, the whatever that I didn't, get from mom or dad growing up. And so I think, we need to find it somewhere. And that's the thing, I think, where some people maybe stop. They just say like, don't go to the woman for that. And then they never really give you the other option. So it sounds like your relationship with God has been really big, your prayer life really big. You mentioned your spiritual director. What other mentors kind of walked alongside you and just challenged you to grow? Yeah,
so that is kind of like the key for my process, was just how to handle my own emotions, where I had because I am, I admit it in broad daylight now, I am a sensitive person, but we think of sensitive as an inherently negative thing. Meaning like you're touchy, or like, whoa, like your emotions are overly active. But we notice that the root word there is the same as sense as sensible. Like, he's a sensible person. That's like a very high compliment. He's sensible. He's got a handle on things. And yet sensitive. So in any case, I think I've had my own grappling with like thinking about, what does it mean to have, I guess, very operative passions, we'll put it that way. I have a daughter who's she has very operative passions. And so it's, at times with temper tantrums, it's ugly and it's intense and messy. And at times when she's very affectionate and very thoughtful, it's just deeply beautiful. And so you just kind of see her little 2-year-old heart. And so I think I had a process of coming to accept that about myself, where I had, unfortunately, a lot of cases of self-loathing for that character trait or that quality. I also heard a homily one time, a priest talking about this notion of masculine and femininity. And we tend to think of like a spectrum. These are the masculine virtues, these are the feminine virtues. And if you possess a lot of these, feminine virtues, like for instance, I can paint pretty well, I can do certain things. I feel like I've been good at listening, understanding, what people tell me and trying to have insight or whatever. Certain things that seem like feminine qualities. And then that seems like I must be pushing the line toward the feminine side, therefore I must be less masculine inherently. And the point he was saying is like, actually, you need to recognize it's more like buckets, that Christ possessed all virtues. And he was the ultimate man, but also we should be aspiring toward all virtues as opposed to like the spectrum of like the tension between male and female. So I think the breakup was very pivotal for me because the fact I felt raw and was kind of at war with myself. And I didn't feel anger at God or even her. I just felt anger toward myself and anger toward my own, kind of personality traits, my own, in some ways, immaturity that I felt manifesting as I couldn't like handle my emotions and I felt like a mess. I felt my friends were kind of leaving me. So I was just too messy to deal with, or I was too much of a Debbie Downer. And that was like a really hard time of feeling very lonely. But that's also the time that I had a lot of mentors kind of come out of the woodwork and really see me and kind of, in some ways, like put that hand on my shoulder saying I wasn't too much. And that, maybe I was a mess, but I was a mess that's worth cleaning up.
I love that.
I will never forget a conversation I had with a mentor. Now he's Brother Maximilian. He's a Benedictine monk, but at the time he was a senior. He talked about like Lazarus and he's like, what did Christ do? And I was like, I knew the answer, but I was kind of like, I don't know. I'm just like, and he says like I'll never forget, he says he effing bald. Maybe it's scandalous that he used the F word and he's a monk now. Wasn't yet. But he was just trying to really make that point to me that Christ had very intense emotions and they were ordered. And there's different moments where he had to go in to pray or he was with people or so forth, but he was a man for all seasons. And that emotion inherently is not an evil thing or a bad thing. And he was trying to heal my own idolization of like the machismo stoic who has no emotions, complete control. And that to me was like the man. And I was trying to achieve it and I felt totally unable to. And my own grandfather actually was also very, I won't call him like emotional, but very on the more sensitive spectrum, if you will. Like deeply artistic, but also an engineer and very mathematical too. And so he possessed a sense of, but he was my grandfather was the one to say, stop and smell the roses, stop and listen to the music and like soak it in. So I think those are the moments that I really kind of accepted my own, this can be a part of my masculinity, in a tangible and good way. And so I think it was, that student now, Brother Maximilian, another senior at the time, his name was also Tommy. He was also had his own kind of struggles. So there's a sense of like camaraderie, but also mentorship because he was older than me. And I would go to his, the porch and talk to him like every Saturday. It was incredible. There was a professor at the college that when I studied abroad really kind of, really affirmed me in the sense of my own mind and intellect, which is also something that wasn't really affirmed before. I come from a pretty smart family and I always felt like I was a dumb ox. And so that was a healing moment as well, of feeling like the sense that my intellect was also good and wanted to talk to me in dialogue and so forth. So, I'll stop there. I don't want to talk too much, but I think the point, though, is that mentors, when I needed to recognize that vacancy to then have them kind of be invited into mentors, like helping me and recognizing they wanted to. When I felt like otherwise my life was always a rental. I had to kind of rent mentors. It's like, okay, I'll tell you my problems and I'll tell it to you quick so you can give me an answer quick and I'll be on my way because I know I'm not your son. Yeah. And I don't belong to anyone. So that was something that's also worked through.
For countless teens and young adults, their parents' divorce is actually the most traumatic thing that they've experienced, but so many feel lost and alone in navigating the challenges. I've been there myself. It's really not easy and it shouldn't be this way. My book, It's Not Your Fault, guides them through those challenges by helping them put their pain into words and begin to heal, work through the emotional problems that they face, cope in healthy ways instead of falling into bad habits, improve their relationship with their parents, navigate the holidays and other life events, and build healthy relationships and so much more. One Amazon review said this book is packed full of really practical help. If you come from a broken family, or even if you don't, but you love someone that does, this book is so helpful. I can't recommend this enough. By the way, it's a quick read and it doesn't need to be read cover to cover. Since it's in question and answer format, you can just read one of the questions and one of the answers. And so if you want to join the thousands of people who've gotten a copy, just go to restoredministry.com/books to get the book or download the free chapters. Again, that's restoredministry.com/books or just click the link in the show notes. Wow. So much there. No, thanks for going through all that. And I see this trend in my story as well as yours of just like the affirmation we receive from like, typically older, wiser men, whether they're like much older than us or like you said, just like a few years ahead of us. There's something really powerful in that. And I don't know if I totally understand it fully, but like we crave that. We need that. Like that's how we become men. That's how we kind of grow in our masculinity. And I love what you mentioned too about how masculinity doesn't just look one way. Like you have to like hunting and drink beer and like do all these like, things that you'd think maybe a typical guy would do. But there's like this possibility of like, yeah, this depth that you can have, which I think is amazing. I think of Pope St. John Paul II, just how he was, such a deep intellectual, but he played sports, he hiked, he wrote poetry, he acted, like all these things that maybe you would think of someone who's more like sensitive or the feminine virtues, like you said. He was probably the most masculine person I can think of. I've met people who like Jocko Willink, if you guys are familiar with Jocko Willink, the Navy SEAL. I've spent a little bit of time with him doing some training, and yeah, he's just as like scary and manly as you'd think. And he's but at the same time, the guy like plays music, and he actually would write like poetry, studied English. Anyway, there's like this kind of dual component, not to go too far into that, but I think that like idea, like for me, was a spiritual director, a mentor. Really, he's a spiritual director, but also he's a married guy who just had training in spiritual direction, wasn't like a priest. So he was able to like kind of affirm me and guide me, mentor me in a way that maybe someone who didn't have that background wouldn't be able to. And man, I just experienced so much healing so much like, I felt like so much more of a man after like meeting with him, working with him, getting his advice. And I think at the core of it was that affirmation. Yeah, no, there's another person in Nashville that after college, I went to Nashville, and he actually now is a therapist. And I was talking to him on the phone when he was in training. So I feel like I kind of stole probably, thousands of dollars of free therapy just by talking to the phone with this guy. But he was also another massive figure in my life of just walking me through things. And I think, when life gets very difficult and challenging, those are the moments you see the whole of not having a father. And I think for those who have divorced parents or separate parents, maybe they're close with mom and not dad, or vice versa. Obviously in my case, it's dad. And so those are the moments you feel the lack of one, pick up the phone and talk to him and not feel like it's a burden because he's your dad. And he wants to help you. But in those moments when, you have a pivotal moment in your life and you don't know who to call, it's difficult. But I think one final note to say on just mentors is that same spiritual director talked about before. He called me one time to kind of do kind of a, quasi phone spiritual direction and talk to me. But I was telling him what I was up to in college. And I was, being truly honest, I was not seeking to brag. I was just telling him what I was up to, which was a lot. Like it was an absurd amount. Like I was like round the clock, I'm managing this and taking these classes, And he's like listening. He's like, "That's all great, Tommy." And he's like, Are you still trying to prove yourself to your dad that's not there to see all this? And it was just like one of those moments of just like straight to the heart of the matter. And I felt like almost like the phone reached out with a hand and punched me in the stomach. And, wow. Yeah.
Because it was just like he saw right through the BS. Not that what I was doing was BS, but he saw the motivation of my excessive, seeking of accomplishments. I've done a lot of things in my life that I'm proud of. That's great. But there's definitely been an undertone of like, prove yourself. Like, again, back to my earlier podcast, in this podcast saying, I know my life's a miracle. I shouldn't have even been conceived. My dad was already showing signs of being unhealthy before I was even conceived. So my life's a miracle. So make it worth something. Or just a sense that my dad's there and do you love me? Do you really love me? It's a sense of this ache of the heart to hear a father's voice to affirm. And when it feels like it's not there, then you find yourself whether consciously or subconsciously chasing an affirmation via accomplishments. So what was healing for me is just trying to tone that down, but also to receive affirmation from men. And then that's also with that girlfriend that, it can be great to receive compliments, but a girlfriend can never give you what you're seeking from a father, obviously. Yeah. And so when I actually had mentors who were older than me, who were actual sages, compliment me or to affirm me in ways that were palpable, those are deeply healing. And actually I could feel different chapters of my life of kind of like slowing down a little bit, that I don't need to hustle so hard just to prove my lovability. Wow. And a lot of us find ourselves chasing this unknown destination just to feel loved by a parent or a wound they're trying to heal. And it's important to diagnose that. Yeah, no, and harder than it seems. Now, looking back, so you're so articulate about it, but I bet it was a journey to even get to that point of figuring it out. So I'm totally with you there. I want to touch on quickly something you said about this idea of being needy or messy or whatever language we'd throw around it. I think there's a lot of people who find themselves in this position, especially if you've gone through trauma and you have your emotions maybe are all over the place. You're struggling with maybe bad habits or your relationship seems not to be working out. And you could feel like this mess, this problem that maybe no one wants to deal with. If someone finds himself in that situation, I'm curious your advice.
what should they do? Because obviously on one end of the spectrum, we don't want to like bring all of our problems to like one person and like dump it on them, because then they'll probably not be able to handle, especially if it's like the friend or a peer or something, not really equipped to do that. On the other end of the spectrum, it could be really dangerous, like we were talking about before, to be like, oh no, I'm gonna like do it solo. I'm gonna go alone and figure this out, and put on a good face. So yeah, what's your advice to someone who maybe finds himself quote unquote needy or kind of helpless?
Well, I mean, one obvious answer would be like therapy is, I think there's been a lot of good movement in the stigma surrounding therapy, that people are recognizing truthfully and properly that, we need doctors for physical health. Why don't we need doctors for mental health? And I think, unfortunately, the trajectory is that we're mentally very unhealthy more and more in the modern age. And so we need a lot of doctors for our minds to help us kind of, so I think there are certain things that are spiritual in nature that you need a priest for, or spiritual direction, and to pray. But there's also certain things that you can't just like pray away. There's like just legitimate psychological things you should consider or work through. I definitely know my dad can pray away his OCD or the abuse that happened to him or his previous history of anorexia. So I think that's one more obvious thing. But even that can be difficult, because I've been to therapy a couple times. But the first two men I saw were, unfortunately, they were very unhelpful. They were actually just kind of, let's figure out the problem, solve it, and just felt like we're kind of talking at me. And I actually felt almost like more of like a burden, like I was taking too long to process, or they feel like my story was being absorbed so that they could kind of have actual insight into my story. And so it just felt like we fix the problem and move on. I think that is a gift that, generally speaking, women bring to this world of not, being too utilitarian in how they approach life. So I would say that should be a viable option, but also that can cost a lot of money. And I think ideally it's also, it's a community of recognizing true mentors and good friends. And I think there's a, I don't know, I guess the more intense the issue or the sensitivity of it, there's more of a tendency to offload it to one person. So it's kind of neat and tidy. And then I can box that. But I think there's something healthy about people who know you and have the right amount of knowledge of you based on their knowledge of you. How do I phrase this? It's like, a lot of people know that I grew up without a dad, but then a lot of my acquaintances may know that, and that's it. And then that can stay that way unless our friendship would deepen. Sure. And then there's like mentors and then deeper friends who know more of a story. And I think it's appropriate because there's a sense of an onion or a layers to people's knowledge of you and your story, so that you're not like, it's one person has all this mess and everyone else thinks my lives picture perfect life. And that's like to live in communities. You don't want to be, back to the, bottle versus brood. You don't want to be like walking out the problems to everybody, but you also don't want to pretend like you're this picture perfect person to everyone you meet as well. So I think, for those who feel messy, I think, seek mentors and don't apologize for it. At least I'm going to give the masculine perspective here. I'm not a woman, but I know going to a man and saying, hey, I've done this to men. I've gotten bolder as I've gotten older. And I'm like, I need advice in this particular area. I actually just grew up without a father. And sometimes there's certain questions I don't know who to ask, and I need a mentor. Awesome. And older men like respond very well typically to that question. Like, I think there's a deep desire for older men to impart their wisdom, which is also being lost in our modern culture, where the idea of older people are considered more outdated and actually less knowledgeable. And younger people are more knowledgeable because we have the internet and are more tech savvy. But the old way of looking at life is that the older people are ahead of you in life, have lived more life, and have more to offer you, more wisdom, and are sages. And so I think we need to reclaim that, of recognizing the wisdom of older and that they can have something to offer us. Even in marriage, like a couple who have lived and been through a long marriage, like, I know this is tough, but you'll be through this and it's going to be okay. And they're not bothered by what you're telling them. And that's deeply consoling. I'm giving just a hypothetical here, but the same can apply to talking to a mentor or a sage about your story of your parents' separation and how to cope with that.
No, so good. And what I've learned there, before we move on, there's like this kind of gentle balance between going to other people for help and, wisdom and guidance and everything, which is like, I totally agree with you. It's super necessary. And in some people's situation, making sure you're acting on it. Because I think there can be this tendency I've seen in some people where we kind of can become addicted to the knowledge or the advice or even the relationship itself, almost as if, oh, well, this problem or this struggle that I have gets the attention of these people that I want their attention. Yeah. And therefore I'm never really motivated to solve it because it keeps getting their attention. And so I think like it's important that we're, actually taking what they say and putting it into action, because I think you can get cut in this loop as well. Anything you'd add there before we move on?
Yeah, I would just say, I think particularly for friends, good friends obviously are not there to let you just vent for venting's sake, but to help you. And so a real friend would also can tell the difference between a need to kind of unload something off your chest or to articulate something versus like, okay, you're just venting now. Didn't you talk to me about this 2 weeks ago? Have you done anything about that? Like, didn't we talk about you doing this or this or this? Have you done any of those things? And a mentor can do that too, but I think sometimes friends in that peer level. And I would add that, this is where community is helpful, is that you're in community, you're with people, and you're accompanying one another. You're carrying each other's burdens. That's true communion of, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Is you don't want to stay in the ugly or the bad, but you also want to celebrate the good, but then you recognize the dynamism of life. And if you're doing phone calls to a friend across the country, they're not with you, not seeing you, or not seeing improvements. And there's something very beautiful about the incarnate experience of being with people, and can hold you accountable to continue to strive toward healing.
I love that. That's great advice. Just before we close down here, I'm curious if there are any other maybe big problems, whether it was bad habits or I know we talked quite a bit about emotions, but emotional problems or kind of relationship struggles that you saw kind of stem from everything that happened within the family.
I could go in to talk about habits, but I think the bigger thing I would articulate is lies that I believed that I had to heal from. And they still crop up. It's not like I'm a totally healed person or something. But the first one I would say is I am alone. That is a huge lie. I mean, again, to speak from my Catholic perspective, the devil, the diabole, literally means to separate, to cast apart, God's whole movement is communion, bringing together, integrity, meaning the integers are one, to remember, to bring back the members into one. And the devil is all about isolation and making you feel like you're alone. Because once you feel like you're alone, you can't ask for anyone to help you, then he's got you and he can do whatever he wants with you, because then he's your master. And so loneliness is a very big epidemic right now. But also the lie of I am alone, because that's an existential thing. And I think I felt that very potently when I had that breakup or other moments in my life, or feeling misunderstood, and then feeling like the accusations like, well, you feel misunderstood because you're so sensitive, and get over it. And then that kind of like deepening, and then that deepening self-loathing, and so forth, and that being a very unhealthy cycle. And so I've had to do a lot of work on trusting that I am not alone. I've prayed through the Gospels of the baptism in the River Jordan, and this is my beloved Son with whom I'm well pleased. And knowing that, I am, and Fathered by God actually was a pivotal book for me to kind of recognize and know that I'm ultimately never alone. I think another one is, just regarding, I already mentioned, but it's I still do it, but I catch myself when I'm doing it. The ways that I'm being performative for the sake of proving my worth. Like thanks be to God, I finished a master's degree. And I know at the culmination of it, it was all good intentions, but there's even in the midst of it, I'm like, okay, am I doing this just to catch up with my siblings? Or am I doing this just to feel at par with others, or to prove myself that I can do it, or that I'm lovable, and those are things you have to ask yourself when you're trying to aspire to some great accomplishment or good, or even how busy you are. For whatever reason, we feel guilty for leisuring in America, especially. It's like, how are you doing busy? And it's like this, we hail it as a wonderful thing when it's not good to be busy. It's actually very bad to be busy. It's a sin to overwork. There's a commandment, the Sabbath day. It's a sin to be lazy. That's true. But it's also a sin to overwork. And so I've had to think about that one of like my own busybodiness. I've prayed a lot through Mary and Martha in the Gospels of Martha just running around, and because ultimately she also wants to be at our Lord's feet and be loved, but she's unable to because of the interior problem, as opposed to Mary, who's got the capacity to just receive. So that's a big one. Yeah, and I think I would say a simpler thing is just like my life's a miracle, which is true, but to accept that as a good thing and not to feel like that's also a diagnosis or an imperative to make my life worthwhile or look impressive or something. And just to live my life and to know that God is found in the present moment, and to live my life following God's will in each day without sort of like trying to aspire to these great things for the sake of saying, see, it was worth it. I'm this great accomplished person. And my life was actually worth living. And that sounds almost suicidal. I don't mean to imply that sort of thing, but that's another thing. Yeah, so I think I would say lies are the ones that I had to battle with the most, of these kind of subliminal things that then manifest in certain actions. Similar to my dad, there's an obsession and there's a compulsion. And I think in the same way for me, there's been lies that I've believed because of an absence of a father and a insecurity, meaning like this lack of a secure knowledge of being beloved, of being a son, and so forth. And that manifesting then as a a compulsion in a sense of my own way, my own way of proving myself because I'm really looking for an answer to a question that should be found elsewhere.
Wow. So good. And I love like that. I've never really heard anyone articulate that whole idea that like, I shouldn't really be here, and so therefore I have to make my life worth something. I think maybe people feel it in a different way, but I love that idea. Like what I heard you saying was like, your life is a gift, not a competition. Like there's not something you need to like win or perform at here, which I think is really beautiful for all of us to hear. So good. I love all that, man. And what else, in addition to anything you've mentioned, would you recommend to people when it comes to healing? You mentioned, mentorship, spiritual direction, therapy. Anything else you would say? I know you mentioned a book here or there too, a few books.
Yeah. I actually want to read your book. I was actually unaware of it until recently, so I'm excited to. There's Life Healing Wounds is another one that I've actually unpacked a little bit. I still haven't finished that book. More explicitly talking about divorce, separation, and so forth. But yeah, I mean, I think, books have been helpful. But I think overall, I think it is owning your story. And in a way that goes back to the same thing we've been talking about a lot of Stoicism versus victimhood, or bottle versus brood, is to process the emotions and to have knowledge to process, like to have knowledge of what happened and to process it. That's more of my story because I have to collect data because I was so young, I didn't even remember it. So my story is different even than my brother's because he saw a lot of it happen when he was like 7 or 8. Whereas for me, like I had no memory. It's a different kind of, in some ways easier, in some ways maybe more difficult. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. It's different. But ultimately I think what's helped me the most is sort of like an ownership of this is my story. And so I don't want to like live by it in the sense of like, oh yeah, I'm the guy without a father, because that can be helpful. Like, so for instance, I work at a high school and I've taught, and there's moments where in class I can see like this question and I can tell a piece of my story that'll be very relevant and helpful. But I don't like walk into places just like revealing it, for the sake of like, oh, look at this guy who suffered. Because I also think that sometimes suffering is weaponized, where it's like I've suffered more, and that's also the victimhood complex of who's the greater victim. And this also breaks my heart about divorce and separation in general, is that it's so common. I think a lot of people don't feel like they have permission to suffer or permission to feel hurt or sadness because like, well, it's half of America, so get over it. And just because something is common does not make it any less intense. And I guess my story seems a bit more exotic, or, well, there's mental illness, there's abuse and family history, and, I grew up without a father and I have a heroic mother. That's all true, but it doesn't mean that like a normal story of parents had disagreements, they divorced, and now you have 2 bedrooms is any less. I mean, in fact, it could be in a lot of ways, many ways, much harder. That I did not experience. I didn't have 2 bedrooms. I wasn't splitting time. So I think it's just a path of ownership and acceptance to live life. So not ignoring, but not identifying with. And that takes many forms of friends, of mentors, of books, of prayer. So I wouldn't give it like one diagnosis. I think that's the goal, but there's many different paths that help build that up.
I love that advice. I remember Alex Hormozi, business influencer guy. He says there's no silver bullets, only like 100 golden BBs. There's like a lot of little things you need to do, and I think it's just so true in life. There's like, man, if there was like one thing you could do to be healthy and whole, we would all probably do it. But there's not. Yeah. There's a lot of little things you need to do. So I love that advice. It's good. And man, we're pretty much out of time now. I wish we could talk more about like relationships and marriage, but maybe we'll save that for a future episode. But I guess in closing, if you could, speak to your parents and maybe say anything that, you would want to just be honest about everything. Like what would you say?
I mean, I have articulated, but I feel like I can never tire of articulating my admiration for my mother and how she handled everything. And how she was, she sacrificed so much for us. So directly to her, there was not much I would want to say directly to my mother of, but I think perhaps to my siblings, it's a feeling that like if I've said something that's been difficult with my mother or challenge, that my siblings come to her defense, and the same that I feel my own sense and immediately come to my mom's defense because we know how much she suffered, how much she's done for us. But that comes with it again is inability to say anything. And that's been challenging because we need to have freedom to process without being accused of being ungrateful. And that's a challenging thing. And I would really emphasize that a lot of people feel like if I criticize or process or say something that's difficult, therefore I must be ungrateful to, it's like, well, look how much my mom suffered, my dad suffered, and they start pointing to those, and it's like, oh, that's all true. I'm not disregarding those by saying this has been difficult for me. Or you misunderstand someone saying something, and like, I know what you meant, but I'm just trying to process what I've understood or perceived it. I mean, to my dad, I think, I wish I could tell him I love him, and I do when I have had those opportunities, and give him those big life updates of his granddaughter, his first grandchild, and that I was getting married, and those letters that I wrote him. But yeah, I do have more honest, raw questions of like, okay, look, how much could you have done? Well, financially speaking, he didn't support us whatsoever. Like it was rough. We grew up externally looking very middle class, but the reality is we grew up very poor. I'm grateful for certain things, but and that was a huge hardship. And so I really believe in providence. I know God will provide, with very little means. But that's one more raw thing I would I wouldn't say to my dad. I don't want to kind of this revengeful, the one-liner mic drop. But in a conversation, there's always more I would love to understand and to forgive, because you can't really forgive what you don't know. And so this is actually still current for me, of like unpacking certain things that happened, and understanding what was truly his illness versus what was more willed, and kind of like a negligence on his part of what he could have done. Because it all began when my mom gave an ultimatum of saying, either you continue going to this therapy, this program to heal, or I have to leave you. And unfortunately, he stopped going, and he's like, I'll be fine. And so my mom left with all of us thinking it would be maybe a day, and that became days, weeks, months, years. So I think there's always a desire to have conversation, but wouldn't be like a one-line mic drop.
Yeah, no, there's a lifetime of things to say, I'm sure. So yeah. I definitely appreciate you sharing all that. And I just appreciate your attention between like acknowledging the good, but also the hard things. And yeah, I think there is that temptation sometimes in all of us to think that those things are mutually exclusive when they're not. You can say both. Yeah, which I definitely think is appropriate and necessary. Tommy, so good to have you, man. Thank you. You have so much wisdom. Like, hope you know that. Like, I'm so impressed to learn a lot from you through this interview. So appreciate you sharing that with all of us. And I know that everyone's better for it. So thank you for being on the show. I want to give you the final word. What final advice, encouragement would you offer to everyone listening, especially maybe that younger you who's out there right now listening? What would you say? What
would I say to my younger self? That's a hard one. I mean, I know this is like maybe corny, but yeah, I mean, just say like, it's not your fault. But that's a loaded question or a loaded statement. Of course we can think of Good Will Hunting and like that scene of like, Matt Damon breaking down, it's not your fault, with Robin Williams. But there's a sense of like owning this happened to you. This is not good. And it's not your fault. So I don't know. To me, that statement implies, this did happen. So accept that, but also forgive them, forgive yourself in a sense for any kind of false accusation that may have occurred in you. To me, it would be like, stop being so performative. Like, you can relax and not try to like do every last thing and feel anxious that you're not doing enough. Your resume is not packed enough and all this other kinds of nonsense. Yeah. So I would say there's been a lot of like seeking approval, seeking love. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing I would say is to know you're loved infinitely. Your life has infinite dignity and value. And it's okay to feel these things, but also to not just to sit in them. And so I guess I keep going back to that same theme of acceptance means recognizing, but not sulking. And that's hard to do. And it's a long process to have patience with yourself. But that is the journey. And we're all in a journey. And so we tend to have this utopian idea of like, okay, I'll be better on the other side. It's like, well, I mean, there is another side, but not fully. Like, we're always going to be in a pilgrimage in the vale of tears. There's always going to be suffering and difficulty. And so it's about acceptance and allowing those things to transform you. But the new sufferings will occur, and to embrace them. So it's not your fault.
That wraps up this episode. By the way, if you want to share your story with us, we'd love to hear it. If you want, we could even post your story as an anonymous blog article on our website. Go to restoredministry.com/story, or just click the link in the show notes to share your story. If this podcast has helped you, feel free to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. You'll avoid missing future episodes and help us reach more people. And if you've already done that, feel free to rate or review the show. We appreciate that feedback, and that also helps people find the podcast. In closing, always remember, you're not doomed to repeat your family's dysfunction. You can break that cycle and build a better life, and we are here to help. And keep in mind the words of C.S. Lewis, who said, you can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending.